Good morning again. It's Jeff here, and I'm going to do a little chat today with Kirk, who you may have been introduced to in some previous posts that we've put up. Say hello, Kirk.
Hello, good morning from Valencia with Mount Salinas behind us.
We're going to have a chat today about two incidents of racial discrimination, if you want to put it that way,
or bias,
or bias in the past, in two different locations in two different countries in opposite ends of the world. One from America, where Kirk comes from, but one in Australia, where I come from. First of all, I'll let Kirk have a talk about what the incident that happened with him when he was younger. Both of these incidents are true. Both of them happened to us personally. So, Kirk, would you like to tell us about your...
Sure.
What happened?
I grew up with a single mother in Woodstock, Vermont, in a very rural environment, growing up on a farm. Grandfather was very present in my life. My mother did not remarry until I was aged 13. And then we moved to a suburb of New York City, a very affluent suburb of New York City, where I had a completely different life from a rural environment in Vermont to a very affluent environment in the in the suburbs of New York City. My parents decided they were going to send me to prep school. I ended up going to a prep school in Connecticut, which was in a small Episcopalian boys' school, which was much different than anything I've ever experienced in my life. We had vespers every morning, we had choir every morning, and then we would have breakfast. There were about 150, 200 students in the school. When I first arrived, the senior class consisted almost 20%, if not 25% of the senior students were black, which to me was a surprise because I'd never in my lifetime been associated with blacks or around them. I did to some degree in Vermont because my mother was a admissions counselor at a private school in Woodstock, Vermont. However, it was completely alien to me, and I was a little taken back because the discipline in the school and the criteria for you in terms of your academics and your behavior was quite rigid. It was not oppressive, but it was rigid. It was an Episcopalian school with a very humanistic headmaster, John Vittery, who was renowned for his, should I say, liberal philosophy and how he impacted religion upon the school and the student body as being of Christ. Where thy helps thy neighbor. At any rate, my experience was I was on the hockey team because I grew up on skates and skis. I was on the hockey team. The captain of the hockey team was a black boy who was like a black student who was like a bowling ball, a bowling pin. And he was so powerful and fast on his skates. And he was the captain of the hockey team. Secondly, the captain of the football team was a big black guy named Raymond Ware, or Ware was his last name. He was the captain of the football team. He was student body president. He had top academic grades. He ended up going to Harvard University. So my experience with blacks awakening at 13, 14, 15 years old was a very, very positive experience. 20% of these guys came from backgrounds that were basically of poverty, and they received aid, financial, from the school to attend the school, but it was not given to them. They were expected to perform. It was not academic scholarship. It was scholarship it was not athletic scholarship, it was for academics. And these guys were nurtured academically. They ended up performing. Mel Ware was captain of the football team, captain of the track team, captain of the baseball team, student body president, extraordinary grades, as were the other students not quite as athletic, but academically at the top of their class of 30 graduating students. That was my impression of blacks at 13, 14, 15 years old. They were very accomplished athletically, some, and very accomplished for the most part academically. I took that with me my entire life. I was never given to prejudice, have never been given to prejudice based on people's ethnicity or race or cultural or economic background because of my experience at the Worcester School in Connecticut. I'll take that with me to my grave, and I'm thankful as hell for it.
So do you know how any of these guys went on after?
Well, Mel, after you and I initially talked, I did a Google search on Mel.
Obviously, the dogs like to have their say as well, but we'll ignore them.
I did a Google search on Mel and found out that he went to university, and then he was drafted or enlisted, but he ended up being in the United States Marine Corps, which is something I would expect of Mel. I mean, Mel would meet his obligation, and Mel would perform at the highest level in the United States Marine Corps. Beyond that, I don't know because I couldn't find anything further. I don't know if he made it out of Vietnam. I don't know what happened to him. The other incident was at 19, 20 years old, I was offered a internship at the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. Very fortunate, 2-year program. You work in props, you work in costuming, you work in the shop, you work in every aspect of the theater for your first year. Second year, you specialize in what it is your interest is. Is it direction? Is it stage management? Is it lighting? Is it shop work? Is it design? What is it? I focused on directing and stage management. So in the second year, that's where my focus was. That year, we happened to do The Great White Hope. The Great White Hope starred Jimmy Jones of Star Wars fame and Jane Alexander, who went on to become the chairwoman of the National Endowment for the Arts. So here I am during the year that Martin Luther King is assassinated, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. Here I am living in Washington, D.C. at the Arena Stage doing The Great White Hope with a cast of 30, 40, 50 blacks from all over the country, from New York City, from Washington, D.C. One day, walking into the shop is a young black man from Washington, D.C. Roger asks the shop foreman, can I sweep the floor? Can I do something? I like to work here. I like to do something. The shop foreman said, sure, and gave him a broom. This is the first year of the internship. Gave him a broom and said, come on, Roger, you can just clean up and you can come every day and you can help us and you can learn, you can work with us after school. Roger did that for the full year. Roger became beloved by the entire staff of the Arena Stage, by the entire group of interns who were 12, and we took Roger in as a friend and we all tried to mentor him. Roger came from poverty, absolute poverty. He knew nothing about the theater, but he was voracious in what he wanted to learn. And he participated in everything, became a part of the community of the Arena Stage. The following year, my second year, he was offered an internship at the Arena Stage. Roger flamingly went through the internship. During the production of The Great White Hope, all of us interns we had secondary roles. We played Mexicans, we played photographers, we filled the stage just with our bodies. During one of the scenes, during the scene where Jimmy just punches a body bag, just punches it. It's supposed to fly out when the lights go black. Well, the ring that was rigged to it so it could fly out popped off. Roger and I both saw that at the same time. We ran onto stage in the black, not saying a word to each other. We ran onto the stage. Roger got on his knees. I got on his shoulder. I reached up and I clipped the ring back onto the bag. The bag flew out. Roger and I ran off stage. Not a word exchanged between us. Best close friends. We had a relationship that was like that. Roger went on, after he completed college, to be one of the leading producers of children's theater in the United States. A guy who came from nothing, a guy who came from poverty, a guy who was willing to work. My experiences with the racial complexity of life, and nothing but positive from my experience. That's my life.
Interesting. Another story. I was brought up in New Zealand. New Zealand is a multiracial country with a lot of settled by people from England, but also has a lot of native Maoris there. And New Zealand was one of the only countries in the world that was never actually conquered. The British signed the Treaty of Waitangi with the Maori people, and so that right from the very beginning they lived in basic harmony with each other. Over the years there was a lot of Tongans and Samoans and Cook Islanders, etc., moved to New Zealand, but even though there was interracial problems between the different islanders and the Maoris, there was never really an awful lot of trouble between blacks and whites. So I was also brought up in a very positive environment, thinking nothing of the fact that people were black or white. It didn't make any difference. You never even thought about it. Right? But at the age of 15, I went to sea. Right? And my first trip, ironically, was up around the Cook Islands and Fiji, Samoa and Tonga. And wonderful, wonderful people up there. Really hospitable, friendly, loving. Very aggressive if you got on the wrong side of them, but there was never any problems interracial. It was just all personal if you did get on the wrong side of them. When I was about late 16s, early 17, I left New Zealand and went to Australia and joined a ship there. And we were tied up at Circular Quay. Circular Quay was these days is an international passenger terminal. It's where all the ferries tie up to travel to the various places around New South Wales. Very upmarket, what we would call downtown area, but certainly not downtown in the way that most people think of it. It's downtown Sydney is very upmarket. It's where many of the major insurance companies, major stockbrokers, etc., where not reside but have their offices. And in those days, there used to be a 6 o'clock closing for the hotels. 6 o'clock closing was introduced in the First World War, basically by the people who were trying to instill a sense of morality within society, and they thought that if they could restrict the amount of alcohol that was in society, they could restrict the immorality in society. Of course, that sort of thing doesn't really work, but they were trying it. The place where we all used to hang out, my apologies, it wasn't 6 o'clock trading when I was there. In 1954, that was abolished and it was raised to 10 o'clock trading. But while 6 o'clock trading was in force, it became customary for people to finish work at 5 o'clock, rush over to the bar and get as drunk as they possibly could by the time 6 o'clock came. And when just before 6 o'clock came, they would line their beers up so that they could keep drinking afterwards. But they weren't allowed to buy liquor after 6 o'clock, but they could keep drinking for a while. It was a time when the introduction of pipes running from the kegs to the nozzle where they could pour the beer was introduced, so that the bartenders could actually serve beer much faster. They didn't have to keep running back to the kegs and filling the glasses. They could just press the gun and fill up the glasses along the way. In 1954, it was raised till 10 o'clock. But the tradition never stopped. Right? And the main hotel in downtown Sydney at that time was the Paragon Hotel, which sits right along Alfred Street on the corner of Loftus Street, looking out over what is now the ferry terminal and is now underneath the Cahill Expressway, which was built over the top of it. Of course, none of that was there in it would have been about 1966, 60s, probably 68, I think, 1968. then the cargo ships used to tie up down there, and they used to unload the cargo. And because the cargo was unloaded by derricks and by hand, not by containers as it is today, when the ships came in, they'd be there for a week or sometimes up to 10 days. So you had a lot of time to see the cities that you were in. So when we used to finish work at 5 o'clock, we'd wander down Circular Quay and cross the tram tracks that were used to run around there, then go to the Paragon Hotel. The Paragon Hotel was literally, in those days, shoulder to shoulder in what they called the public bar, right? Which was just a bar where people would just swill one after another. And it was all whites. There was not really any blacks there at all, except that they used to have what they called the gin raffles. Gin is a Aboriginal term which actually means woman. Traditionally it means woman. It doesn't mean gin like the liquor we have today. So that a gin in those days was just an Aboriginal woman. And what they used to do was to raffle the woman off. So about 8 o'clock, a couple of hours before closing time, they used to start bringing around raffle tickets and selling raffle tickets. From memory, that there were about 2 bob, which is what, 20 cents a ticket, going back quite a long time, but about 2 bob a ticket, and they used to sell I don't know how many tickets, and whoever won the raffle got to take the Aboriginal girl home for the night. Right? It was racial discrimination in its most blatant form that you could ever have, where they were just treating Aboriginal women like absolute commodities. Most of them, by our terms, were definitely not what you might call pretty. Aboriginals, especially the full-blood Aboriginals, are about as black as you can possibly get. They're really very, very dark skinned, very wide noses, not what we will call attractive in any way. But of course, once you've had 3 or 4 hours of swilling beer, everybody looks pretty. As the saying goes, I have never been to bed with an ugly woman. Woken up beside many of them, but never been to bed with an ugly woman. Woken up beside many of them, but never been to bed with an ugly woman. I don't know what used to happen after the raffles were decided, what used to happen to these women, because I never really got involved in it. I was 17. I was actually underage, but nobody really cared in those days about the age for drinking. It was all very mind-blowing for a 17-year-old to be introduced to something like this when they really had no concept of discrimination in any way. And then in those days, I never even used to think about it as discrimination. It was just what happened in Sydney. There was just this was just what happened. Like when I travelled around the world to many other countries and you came across things that very, very strange things, I never really judged the right or wrong of them. It was just a matter of, well, that was their custom. You'd go to the bullfights in Spain and you'd see the bulls being killed after each fight, and sometimes the bulls would kill the matadors. I've seen that a couple of times, where the bulls have actually killed the matadors. But I never judged the right or wrong of animal rights or animal wrongs or anything like that. This was their tradition. This was the way they did things, and it was not really for me to judge. It was just for me to observe. And that's what I did in the Paragon Hotel in Sydney in those days. It was just a matter of observing what went on. Later on, of course, once you start thinking a little bit more about racial rights and racial discrimination, you can see the abhorrence of what used to happen then, but it was just what happened, you know.
Well, I think it's all a part of the cultural experience, and I mean, you and I lived in a completely different cultural world than the people who live in the outback of Australia, the people who live in the Middle East, the people who live in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They have a whole different outlook on life and their own cultural experiences. And if I go to Saudi Arabia, it's not for me to contradict their experience. I can't speak to their experience. Here in the Philippines, living in the Philippines, it's difficult for me to speak of the experience of people who live in the mountains, the people who live in the barrios. I can't speak to that because I haven't lived it. The best thing I can do is if I see someone who is abused, if I see somebody who is threatened, I mean, being who I am, I will speak up. I will not tolerate a woman who is being abused. That's just me. And I don't care if it puts me in physical risk. But I will not impose my cultural attitudes or biases on a community. When it comes to individuals, yes, if I'm given the opportunity, I will try to step into it if I'm not putting my life at risk. And sometimes it's worth putting your life at risk, you know. But you can't step on people's cultural experiences. You can't, I mean, you know.
If we both come from countries who do not have enviable records for tolerance with racial problems. I mean, in America, the blacks were mostly introduced into the country, so they come in after the whites. But even before that, the Indians, the natives there, basically genocide, almost genocide, was committed against many of the Indian tribes, as it was in Australia. Most of the Aboriginals in Tasmania, for example, it was complete genocide. They left no full-blood native Aboriginal alive in Tasmania. Some of them on the mainland did survive, but the genocide, the racial discrimination in both our countries are certainly nothing that either of us could be proud of. You know?
Well, it's not even a matter of being, it's my country and your country, we have changed to some degree. But there's parts of my country culturally that are still in that period back in the 20s and the 30s where there's very little respect for women or for people of color. Now, that's their cultural experience. I don't have to respect it. I don't have to live it. And I can't comment it on. That's their lives. If it starts impacting me or starts impacting my daughter, that's when I speak up. But as to their choices, that's the lives they lead. That's right. It's not for me to, it's only for me to pass judgment when it intrudes upon my life personally.
Well, I was talking to Kirk the other day, just sitting around having a cup of coffee, and he happened to relay this story, and I sort of thought, I said to him at the time, look, I have a story too. Why don't we combine and tell the people about these two incidents, right, that happened to us personally? It's not second-hand or third-hand or fourth-hand information. It's just our own personal experience of what happened. So we thought, let's share it, and let's let the people make up their own mind about what they think. We can't influence it. We can just.
But I think importantly, in terms of my own experience, I've traveled throughout the world like Jeffrey has. I've been in every circumstance you can possibly imagine in my travel. Here in the Philippines, one thing I learned when I was traveling in Egypt, I sailed up the Nile River with myself and a Sudanese boatman, and we would stop on an island in the middle of the Nile River, and the island was for the cattle and was for the goats to keep them away from, in the swift moving water as it was going around the island, to keep the predator animals away from the livestock. Now, those kids, when we would stop our sailboat, we would stop and moor at the headway of the island, again to keep crocodiles away from us in the fast moving water. Those kids were remarkable in what they were able to do and what they were able to achieve. On their level, you would stop along the shore and you would eat this bouillabaisse of fish that was in this big iron crock pot, and people will give it to you. Here in the Philippines, you go to the mountains and you watch how they build a nipa hut, and you go, holy shit, man, they're doing this without tools. You learn to respect people and not pass judgment. That's the thing I got from my experience growing up as a 13, 14-year-old. You didn't pass judgments on people. You learned to respect what they were and how they were. And I'm grateful forever for understanding the smartest people in the world most often are the ones that have the least education. And have to respect it.
Yeah, that's right. And it's amazing what happens if you do respect other people's culture, how doors open and you are invited in and have the most amazing experiences sometimes.
I mean, here is an expat living in the Philippines. Jeffrey is one of my very few friends who are foreigners. My preference has been to make friends among Filipinos and respect those friendships. It's also opened my life to the Filipino culture, which I traveled, 8,000 miles from home. Why do I want to travel 8,000 miles from home just to hang out with people who are of my own cultural heritage, my own skin color? I travel to a country. I want to know the country. I want to know the people. I want to experience the country. I want to experience the people. And I'm allowed to do that because very early on, I had no cultural biases. I wasn't taught about cultural bias.
And you live the life that they advertise in the Philippines. If you do that, it's more fun in the Philippines. So we hope you've enjoyed today's stories.
Maybe we're both full of shit. I don't know.
Possibly very true. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
All right. Long-winded we are.